The Problem of God: Answering a Skeptic's Challenges to Christianity by Mark Clark. Chapter 2: The Problem of God's Existence. Frodo began to feel restless, and the old paths seemed too well trodden. He looked at maps and wondered what lay beyond their edges. Maps made in the Shire showed mostly white spaces beyond its borders. J.R.R. Tolkien, The Lord of the Rings. When I was a kid, I used to get pulled behind my friend's bicycle on rollerblades. I would hold on to a long rope tied to his bike seat, and he would pull me around the neighborhood. My mother once saw us doing this and said, "I want you to stop, you're going to get hurt." I replied, "How do you know I will get hurt? Where's the evidence?" Unless I saw some, I refused to believe her promise. I continued to get pulled behind the bike day after day until the bright midsummer afternoon I came swinging around a corner. There in front of me was a car driving toward me full speed. I threw myself flat on the ground, skidded across the asphalt, and came to a stop directly underneath the car. My back and legs were ripped, and it took weeks until the pain of all the cuts and bruises subsided. As I laid there in pain on the asphalt, one thought hit me: evidence. Finally, I had it firsthand and was willing to believe. I've always been that way. I still am. The debate about the existence of God centers on the question of evidence. Things we now take for granted as true, e.g., gravity, were all at one time hypotheses that needed proof or explanation before the scientific community and the general public accepted them as fact. If someone proposes an idea to us, we consider its validity based on the evidence to support it. We then take that evidence and deduce certain things about the world, even if it causes us to rethink views we previously held. Finally, we change the way we live in light of that new belief. This is foundational to life and progress. If we are going to believe in God, then we must ask what the evidence is for his existence. What proofs and clues are there that an all-powerful, eternal, infinite being actually exists? If the evidence is there, we must have the courage to rethink what we may have previously believed, and then change our lives accordingly. If it isn't, then we must look that square in the face and be willing to abandon belief in God. So, are there evidences of his existence? Modern science and philosophy overwhelmingly say yes. Alvin Plantinga points out that there are 24 or so philosophical arguments for God's existence. For the sake of our exploration, we will boil down the evidences of two broad categories that philosopher Immanuel Kant, 1724 to 1804, named the moral law within and the starry hosts above. Or, as Plato framed it, there are two things that lead man to believe in God: the argument from the existence of the soul, and the argument from the order of the motion of the stars. Plato, Laws, 12:966e. In other words, anthropology and cosmology, people and the universe. Together, they will help us realize that it may be more rational to believe that God exists and that he does not. First, the evidence that comes from people, or the soul, as Kant put it. C.S. Lewis, an Oxford professor and philosopher, was a skeptical atheist most of his life. He opens his book Mere Christianity by pointing out why he began to believe in God in the first place: the existence of morality. Everyone has heard people quarreling, he says. They say things like this: "How do you like it if anyone did the same to you? That's my seat. I was there first. Leave him alone. He isn't doing you any harm. Why should you shove in first? Give me a bit of your orange. I gave you a bit of mine. Come on, you promised." People say things like that every day. Educated people as well as uneducated, and children as well as grown-ups. Now what interests me about all these remarks is that the man who makes them is not merely saying that the other man's behavior does not happen to please him. He's appealing to some kind of standard of behavior, which he expects the other man to know about. It looks, in fact, very much as if both parties had in mind some kind of law or rule of fair play or decent behavior or morality, or whatever you like to call it, about which they really agreed. I watch my kids and their friends playing together every day, and from my observations, I've deduced that human beings are exactly the way Lewis describes. You got to sleep with Mom and Dad last night, so I get to sleep with them tonight, my 7-year-old says. It's my turn on the trampoline. You had your turn, my youngest cries. They're constantly appealing to an unspoken yet agreed upon understanding of the universe, that there is an objective standard of fair and that we should follow rules. But who told them about these rules? Lewis's point is that no one really did, nor did anyone have to. They are predisposed to believe them. This is built within them, and of course, this does not just pertain to children but to all of us. Recently, my family and I were at the Seattle Zoo and had lined up at a dinosaur exhibit so my kids could climb up on a large plastic stegosaurus and get a picture taken on it. We got to the front of the line and were just about to walk up the dinosaur when a woman and her family cut right in front of us. My wife stared daggers at the woman and demanded, "Excuse me, what are you doing?" The woman snapped back, "What did you say to me?" as her children romped up top of the dinosaur's head. "You just cut in front of us." "That's what I said," my wife retorted. "I didn't cut in front of you," the woman said, pushing out her hip. By this point, all of our kids were up on the stegosaurus, yelling at each other. The wives were yelling at each other, and the other dad and I were just standing there looking at each other. "Hey," I said. That's all I could muster. There's a moral code that says, "Don't cut in front of me," and we all agree on it. We all know it's wrong to cut in line. But where did we get this transcendent view of morality that spans across cultures and time? When did we all agree on these fundamental morals? Christianity says that they came from God. In order to have a moral law, you need a moral lawgiver, someone who decided cutting in line is wrong and hand-wired it into us as human beings, a reality that separates us from the animals. Skeptics push against this explanation and say that morals do not transcend culture, but are merely a product of it. In other words, what one person believes about right and wrong is true for her, but not necessarily for everyone. And thus, we should not impose our morals on other individuals or cultures. I understand where this sentiment comes from, and I believed it with all my heart for many years. But over time, I came to see that philosophically and practically, this idea doesn't make any sense and is logically bankrupt. When a person embraces this relativistic understanding of morality, they no longer have a leg to stand on. You can't get angry when somebody cuts you off. You have no reason to scream at them. You can't say one view on abortion is right over another, or that polluting the environment is wrong. The best you can say is that you can't happen to agree with it. But logically, it is not clear why a moral relativist should care that anyone else believes. But, of course, we all know this is wrong. We feel like we should care. We know it's wrong to cut people off. We know it's wrong to drop napalm on babies, to hate someone because of his or her race, or to murder innocent women and children. Even if you travel to a culture that takes joy in those things, you would still deem them wrong. Would you not? But why? Lewis and Kant say because there is a law, or rule that transcends our cultural values or human experiences. There's an absolute right and wrong in the universe. What if they ate your sister? Many skeptics push against the idea that a moral law is evidence for the existence of God. Their solution is to say that our moral values are not objective at all, but come from our evolutionary development. In other words, they are socially constructed, a product of our culture and upbringing. A commitment to this view of morality, however, forces people into a strange corner. For instance, I used to work at a Michael's Arts and Crafts store in college, and one of my coworkers was an ardent and articulate atheist. He and I would often get into discussions about God and Christianity while working at the cash register or hanging wreaths or putting away googly eyes. One day he said to me, "I believe all morality is culturally constructed, relative, or a product of our evolution, that it's wrong for our Western ideals to be projected onto other cultures." To test how committed he was to this belief, I asked him, if we went into a village in the middle of a jungle somewhere and we brought your sister along and they captured her, tied her up, tortured her, and then ate her alive because that's what their culture believed in, how would you feel about that? What would your response be? If you are true to your worldview, you could not say they had done something decisively wrong. You could only say that they did something you didn't like, but that is nonetheless morally acceptable. He sat there for a minute or so, weighing his options. And then he looked at me and said, "As much as it would hurt me to say it, I would not say they did something wrong, but something I personally disagreed with." This is the fundamental problem with moral relativism, and why it is a less rational option to adopt into a larger framework of life and society as a whole. It is not sustainable as a way to order society and is self-contradicting at its core. Despite what my friend said that day, I know he was lying to me. Moral relativists still care. We all care. In the 1960s and 70s, the inconsistency of moral relativism was on full display. In one breath, that generation, committed as they were to a sexual revolution, was saying, "No one is going to tell me what I can do with my body. I'll do whatever I want with it. Morality is relative to the person who concludes it. Stop trying to impose your old-fashioned, traditional views of sex on me." And yet, in the next breath, they were protesting the Vietnam War, which they saw as morally unjust, and, in so doing, were imposing their views on everyone else, whether others wanted to hear them or not. But who were these to decide that the war was immoral and impose their views on the government? When you remove objective reality from the picture, can't those in power kill whomever they deem an enemy? What absolute moral law were the protesters citing to say otherwise? By its own ethics, the flower power of the 1960s and 70s should never have tried to impose its moral views on others. But they did. So where did they get their convictions of what just and unjust wars are? Where did the concept of an unjust war come from anyway? It doesn't make sense unless there really is an objective measure to compare our lives against. That's the point of the moral law. We do believe in right and wrong. We believe hurting a child is wrong. We believe raping and pillaging the environment is wrong. We believe all races should be equal, that there is such a thing called justice, and tells us mercy is better than hate, that loyalty is a virtue, and that there is evil in the world. All of these convictions give meaning to our lives. But if there is an absolute right and wrong, all of them go away. They are but a mirage, meaningless, weightless, worth abandoning with every other construct of modernity. Those are the stakes. What Dawkins gets wrong. Even if you don't accept that objective moral value exists, let's assume for a moment that they do. What does that tell us about the universe in which we live? We can observe that humans appear to be wired with a sense of right and wrong. The Apostle Paul contends as much in his letter to the Romans, for when Gentiles who do not have the law by nature do what the law requires, they show that the work of the law is written in their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness. Romans chapter 2, verses 14 and 15. By saying that the law is written, Paul is implying that there is a writer, and that rings true not only as a biblical teaching, but experientially in our lives. It is important to note that I am not saying that belief in or agreement with a certain set of morals is necessary for them to exist. This is a point often misunderstood by skeptics. In The God Delusion, for instance, Richard Dawkins cites the thought experiments of Harvard biologist Mark Hausser, in which Hausser proposes hypothetical scenarios about 5 people being saved from being hit by a train by the sacrificial death of one fat man, and 5 people in a hospital being saved by harvesting the organs of one healthy man in the waiting room, pointing out that 97% of people agree that it is immoral to kill the fat man and the healthy man in the hospital in order to save the many. He says the main conclusion of Hausser's study was that there was no statistically significant difference between atheists and religious believers in making these judgments. This seems compatible with the view, which I and many others hold, that we do not need God in order to be good or evil. What Dawkins fails to understand is that Christians agree that you do not need to believe in God to be good or to want to be good. The study simply proves that Christianity actually proposes that every person has what the Apostle Paul calls a law written in their hearts, whether they believe in God or not. As John Calvin said, there is no nation so lost to everything human that it does not keep within the limits of some laws, some notions of justice and rectitude, as they could not otherwise distinguish between vice and virtue. Why then do human beings and cultures disagree with one another on what is vice and virtue at times? Why does a village believe in eating people if it's objectively wrong? Because, like mathematics, people sometimes get their answers wrong. But that doesn't mean the multiplication table isn't right or that it doesn't exist. Morals are not a matter of mere taste or opinion any more than math equations. Human beings may not get the moral math problem correct, but that doesn't change the fact that there really is a right answer. Is there an evolutionary explanation? The modern tendency is to argue that there is no object moral law in the universe, that whatever values we do have as a species can be explained without God, because they came about through the process of evolution. There are many circumstances in life where we ensure our own survival by acting favorably towards others, skeptics say, not because of some kind of altruism, but for selfish gain. Loving one's neighbor, for instance. The Darwinian explanation is that we want to ensure our own genes continue on through our children, thus we treat them favorably. We act with reciprocal altruism, where we do good to others to benefit ourselves. These moral urges were programmed into our brains. In ancestral times, when we lived in small and stable bands like baboons, when we had the opportunity to be good only towards close kin and potential reciprocators. Any notion of absolute good is what Dawkins calls a misfiring, a precise mistake, a precious mistake. The problem with this explanation for good, as many have pointed out, is if we inherit our morality from genes within survival, is the utmost consideration. Many of our modern moral constructs are unexplainable and even counterproductive. For instance, Why would laying down your life for people you have never met be considered heroic rather than stupid? There is no good evolutionary explanation for why we would ever come to adopt many of the more selfless principles we have come to value as a species. As Timothy Keller points out, for evolutionary purposes, hostility to all people outside one group should be widely considered moral and right behavior. Yet, today we believe that sacrificing time, money, emotion, and even life, especially for someone not of our kind or tribe, is right. If we see a stranger fall in a river, for instance, we jump in after them or feel guilty for not doing so. Most people will feel this obligation. The question is, how could that trait have come down by a process of natural selection? Some people would have been less likely to survive and pass on their genes. Not only do naturalistic explanations for the origins of morality and consciousness fall short, but they also have embedded in them ghastly moral trajectories. According to natural selection, there are, for instance, races within the human species that are deemed as more advanced than others, and that therefore should be favored over others. This is illustrated by the full and less commonly referenced title of Darwin's most popular work on the origin of species by means of natural selection, or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. Darwin's explanation of origins contains within it a prejudice against what he calls unfavored races. For example, the mentality challenged, whom he contended should not be allowed to marry or reproduce because they will hinder our progress as a species. Man scans with scrupulous care the character and pedigree of his horses, cattle, and dogs before he matches them. He says, but when he comes to his own marriage, he rarely or never takes any such care. Both sexes ought to refrain from marriage if they are in any marked degree inferior in body or mind. While this idea seems staggering to us in the modern world, this kind of thinking was quite popular in the 1920s and 30s, as many progressives began to advocate for exactly these kinds of policies. It was perfectly normal for popular thinkers such as J.B.S. Haldon to contend for eugenics, the belief in the possibility of improving the quality of the human species by discouraging reproduction by persons having genetic defects or inheritably undesired traits, since it was understood that this is where naturalistic Darwinian science leads. Haldon argued for the optimization of the human gene pool by preventing certain types of people from breeding. This was an attitude grounded in the best science of the time and with the best motivation to ensure the survival and flourishing of the human race in a dog-eat-dog world. Bertrand Russell followed Haldon in his Marriage and Morals, 1929, in which he contended for a compulsory sterilization of the mentally deficient, asserting that the state should be empowered to forcibly sterilize all those regarded as mentally deficient by appropriate experts. By reducing the number of idiots, imbeciles, and feeble-minded, he said, society would benefit to a degree that outweighs any dangers of sterilization's misuse. These were widely held views among the British and American intellectual elite in the period between the two world wars, the era of the rise of scientism as a worldview. During these years, there were 3 international eugenics congresses: London 1912, New York 1921, and New York 1932, that argued for birth selection and for the genetic elimination of those who were deemed unfit. Similarly, Adolf Hitler took Darwinism to its natural conclusion. In his 1925 book, Mein Kampf, he wrote, "If nature does not wish that weaker individuals should mate with the stronger, she wishes even less that a superior race should intermingle with an inferior one, because in such cases all her efforts throughout hundreds of thousands of years to establish an evolutionary higher stage of being may thus be rendered futile." He who does not wish to fight in this world, where permanent struggle is the law of life, has not the right to exist. Why don't we adopt this way of thinking? Why not take a worldview like naturalism all the way to its intended end, as these thinkers did? Why not pick and choose which parts we like and which parts we don't? The very fact that something within us is repelled by racism, sexism, and the unequal treatment of the poor and disabled begs the question that such convictions would have to come from somewhere, for they are not natural. Naturalism by itself would lead us to conclusions similar to Holden and Russell, would it not? The existence of such contrary to nature convictions is a very strong evidence for the existence of God. A mind who placed within us a moral law which includes the love of all people and the passion to even lay down our very lives for perfect strangers when necessary, knowing full well we personally may not benefit at all. Such is what it means to have the heart of God stitched into our being. The evidence of cosmology. The second evidence of God's existence we will explore comes from the world of cosmology, the starry hosts above, as Kant called them. From the times of Aristotle, Plato, and Aquinas, a concept known as contingency has been a very important part of science. The idea is that if something begins to exist, its existence is dependent on something outside of it that pre-existed it, causing it to come from being. You are sitting where you are right now reading this book, but you didn't always exist. Your existence is contingent up to your parents existing, meeting, falling in love, lighting some candles one night. You get the picture. Everything that begins to exist has to have a cause. On this, scientists and philosophers, both atheists and theists, agree. David Hume, the 18th century Scottish skeptic, even admitted, "I never asserted such an absurd proposition that anything might arise without a cause." So what is the non-contingent, infinite, uncaused something that has always existed, that had no beginning? For most of history, the atheist and agnostic response has been simple. You don't need God to start the universe, the non-contingent eternal thing in the universe itself. This is precisely how most people, even today, answer the questions of origins. This was always difficult to dispute, because there was little evidence to the contrary, until 1929, that is, when Edwin Hubble made what has been called the greatest scientific discovery of the 20th century. He discovered that the universe itself actually began to exist. The Big Bang. Working out of his laboratory in California, Hubble looked through his 100-inch telescope farther than anyone had ever looked into space and observed something incredible. He saw that galaxies were moving rapidly away from each other in a universe vaster than anyone had ever imagined. And as the galaxies moved away from each other, the universe and space itself was getting bigger. Further scientific study concluded that the galaxies were moving apart because they were once flung apart by a massive explosion. By measuring the speed and distances of the galaxies' movement away from each other, Hubble was able to deduce that modern cosmology now confirms. All galaxies, stars, planets, energy, and matter had a common point of origin, approximately 15 billion years ago, when all the mass in the universe was compressed smaller than a single atom. Our universe, he discovered, came into existence with a single cosmic explosion, the Big Bang. The number of stars involved in this galactic dispersal suggested an astoundingly vast universe. Some galaxies were millions of light years away. Hubble noticed that planets and entire galaxies were hurtling away from one another at fantastic speeds. Moreover, space itself seemed to be getting bigger. The universe was not expanding into background space. Incredibly, space itself was expanding along with the universe. Scientists realized right away that the galaxies were not flying apart because of some mysterious force thrusting them away from each other. Rather, they were moving apart because they were once flung apart by a primeval explosion. According to the Big Bang Theory, all space, matter, energy, even time itself, began to exist at a point in the past. This is important to understand, as people often think that Big Bang cosmology says that 15 billion years ago, matter and galaxies started receding from one another into existing time and space. But the reality is that the galaxies themselves are actually at rest in space. They recede from one another because space itself is expanding. In addition to the expansion of space itself, the second law of thermodynamics, which tells us that the energy of the universe is decreasing, also hints at the finite nature of the universe because it tells us that the energy of the universe is limited and dying. The universe is like a flashlight running on batteries. If it were eternal, it would have already run out of energy. Simple science. The Big Bang explanation of the origin of the universe is now accepted in all major fields of science. Now that acceptance came about, however, illustrates how easy it is for us to deny evidence that points toward conclusions at which we are uncomfortable. Big Bang cosmology was originally rejected by the scientific community, not because of some flaw with its data, but because, as Associate Professor of Physics at Auburn University J.M. Wersinger points out, seemed to give in to the Judeo-Christian idea of a beginning of the world, and as it also seemed to have to call for an act of supernatural creation. It took time, observational evidence, and careful verification of predictions made by the Big Bang model to convince the scientific community to accept the idea of a cosmic genesis, a successful model that imposed itself on a reluctant scientific community. Let's think about that reluctance for a moment. The observable beginnings of the universe and its limited energy are significant problems if one wants to argue that the universe is the unceased, eternal something that has always existed. That's why many scientists were reluctant to accept the idea of a Big Bang theory. It did not match that they wanted to believe. But science has now concluded that the universe is not the unceased, uncaused source of all that exists because the universe itself has a birthday. It began to exist 15 billion years ago. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. Again, this pushes us back to the question of what caused the Big Bang. What's a logical answer to that question? The logical explanation is that the cause is something outside the material universe. In other words, the cause must be mind, not matter, because matter itself began to exist at the Big Bang. What led to the Big Bang? Something immaterial that transcends the universe. That's where the evidence points us. That's exactly what Christianity has been claiming from the beginning. Nobody times nothing equals everything. God seems to have stitched this evidence into history so that we could find it, follow the evidence wherever it leads us, and thus find Him. But that doesn't mean we all follow the evidence. Most people have attempted to deny that this cosmological evidence leads to God. There have now been almost 90 years of speculation since the Hubble discovery, and skeptics have produced different theories and continue to work on more about why the Big Bang doesn't necessitate a cause outside of itself. The most predominant theory is called the nothing hypothesis. It's not hard to grasp. It goes like this. What caused the Big Bang? Nothing. Did it happen? Yes. What caused it? Nothing. It just happened. Assuming we all want to be rational, responsible people who use our minds and follow evidence wherever it leads us, it doesn't take a genius to realize that this explanation doesn't work scientifically, philosophically, or experimentally. One night recently, I was awakened by our house alarm. I jumped out of bed and went running downstairs to see if someone had broken into our house. No one was there, so I shut off the alarm and went back upstairs. I looked at my wife and asked, "What caused the alarm to go off?" Her eyes still closed, she said, "Nothing. Now come back to bed." Now, you and I both know that she was being irrational at that moment. Nothing, really. Saying nothing doesn't work. That's what tired people say when they just want you to shut up and go back to sleep. You'd say non-explanation. What she meant was that we likely weren't going to figure it out that night. It may have been a problem with the wiring or the phone line. One of the kids' windows popped open. Who knows? The bottom line is this. It wasn't nothing. Something caused the alarm to go off that night. So what is a rational, scientific, and theological compelling equation to build our life on? Would you at least consider the possibility that a mind that transcends all space, time, and matter created all things in a moment? My argument is that it's better than nothing. This event, however, it happened, is what Genesis calls the beginning. Genesis 1:1. God created the universe, starting with light and moving from there. See Genesis 1:3. Is it astrophysicist Robert Jastrow says in his book, God and the Astronomers, now we see how the astronomical evidence leads to a biblical view of the origin of the world. The details differ, but the essential elements and the astronomical and biblical accounts of Genesis are the same. The chain of events leading to man commenced suddenly and sharply at a definite moment in time, in a flash of light and energy. So, whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe had a cause. The award-winning scientist who mapped the human genome, Francis Collins, agrees. The Big Bang cries out for a divine explanation. He says, it forces the conclusion that the nature had a defined beginning. I cannot see how nature could have created itself. Only supernatural force that is outside of space and time could have done that. The evidence of design. The final evidence we will consider for the existence of God is that of the design of the universe. There is a strange and mysterious design to the cosmos, an anti-randomness that points strongly to a designer who created and crafted the world with very intentional precision and balance. While much can be said about this, we will limit our discussion to two disciplines within human science, biology and astronomy. You can think of these as the microscope and the telescope, and both of them point us to a balancer, sustainer, and designer. Some will look at the evidence of this design and reject it as chance or luck. In my estimation, it takes a leap and measure of faith. I can't justify to do that. Biology. Scientists tell us that when one looks at the DNA of any living organism, it is packed with coherent and information-filled code. Not random, but intelligent, structured information. An amoeba, for instance, has enough structured and meaningful data to fill 30 encyclopedias. This is such a profound and amazing evidence for the existence of an intelligent mind that it is what Francis Collins calls the language of God. He points out that a genetic code is built into every living organism, down to the level of a single strand of DNA. Think about the complexity involved in this. 30 encyclopedias of information packed into an amoeba, an organism composed of a single cell. The step toward God, an intellectual designer of the code, is not a very large leap of faith. When we observe the presence of intelligible, structured, coherent language or communication, we typically assume it is the creation of an intelligent life and mind. Astronomy. What about the evidence from the stars? The famous philosopher William Paley, 1743 to 1805, pointed out that if you were walking along the beach and came across a piece of wood, you might say, "This must have chipped off a tree and ended up here. That is its origin." But if you continued on and found a watch with all the complexity of its moving parts and pieces, you would probably deduce that someone had designed it, not that it had been produced over time by accident. Paley says that the same logic is true regarding the design of our universe. There is something scholars call the anthropologic principle, which has been called the most powerful argument for the existence of God. The principle suggests that the universe is fine-tuned. The mathematical chances of our universe ever coming into existence are so tiny that they are at the level of the miraculous. But that's not all. The chances that all the life-permitting variables needed to line up perfectly to birth our universe within such a specific range are so low that mathematicians tell us they cry out for an explanation. The improbability of the existence of our universe begs us to wonder how it exists at all. Scholars tell us that the chance of our universe coming into existence is 1 chance in 10 to the 138th decimal. To put this into context, consider that 10 to the 17th is our best estimate of the number of seconds in the entire history of the universe, and 10 to the 70th is the number of atoms in the entire universe. So the probability of the universe coming into existence and the way it has fine-tuned for human life is impossible. Astrophysicists tell us that there were around 122 variables that would have had to be lined up in precise values in order for our universe to come into existence. And if any of those was off by even 1 part of a millionth, matter would not have been made at coalescence. There would have been no galaxies, no stars, no planets, and no people. Astronomer Fred Hoyle concludes, a common-sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a superintelligent has monkeyed with physics, as well as chemistry and biology, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. In addition to the improbability of our universe existing in a way that allowed life to develop by random chance, there is also the question often overlooked by many skeptics, one that is difficult to explain without a designer in the picture. That is, when did the law of physics themselves begin to exist? It is one thing to say that 122 dials would have to be dialed in, but it is another to determine where these dials even came from. The laws that govern physical matter would need to exist prior to the Big Bang. They would not come into existence at the same time as the Big Bang itself, or else they would not do their work. In other words, certain conditions had to exist prior to the existence of the material universe. This is an admitted challenge for atheists. I was once watching a debate with Richard Dawkins, and when the question of the pre-existence of the laws of physics was raised, he admitted that physics does not yet have its Darwin. What he meant was that the field of physics doesn't have a theory of origins or the laws of physics themselves. I believe that, in this case, the theist has a more rational view than the atheist. Mind came before matter. The universe itself was created according to the laws that predate the existence of it. This is the most, not the least rational explanation of first causes in the marketplace of ideas, all of which is why renowned scientist Stephen Hawking concluded, if the rate of expansion 1 second after the Big Bang had been smaller by even 1 part in 100,000 million millionths, the universe would have recollapsed before ever reached its present size, into a hot fireball. The odds against a universe like ours emerging out of something like the Big Bang are enormous. I think there are religious implications. Hawking isn't willing to accept an explanation of chance. You shouldn't either, because chance is not an explanation. It is a non explanation and certainly the less rational of the two options. What if I don't want to believe? I believe there are several reasons why we can know with a high level of confidence that God exists. We have moral instincts, and the best explanation is that these exist because the one who designed us is righteous. We can look at the universe and the world around us and see that it is littered with evidence of design. The evidence itself is what forces us to rethink our presuppositions about the world. Our desire in life is to follow evidence, not run from it. So, where is the evidence leading us when it comes to the nature of humankind and the universe itself? It's leading us to the conclusion that there is a non contingent, uncaused reality that created all things. Mind had to exist before matter, which is the opposite of what atheism teaches. Matter led to mind and consciousness, it says, put on point with exactly what Jesus taught us about God. God is spirit. He said, John 4:24. This is part of the reason no one has to prove that someone created God, as is the challenge on the playground. Then who created God? We have no evidence that God ever began to exist. The best we can prove is that the universe began to exist. If you don't want to believe the evidence, the onus is on you for proving God's non existence, which is not as easy as it seems. When we reject the existence of God, we create more problems than we solve. Moral and philosophical problems, yes, but even scientific ones. A short time ago, I was studying in a Catholic monastery. I spent the morning in my room and then left for lunch. When I left my room, the window was closed and locked. When I came back, it was open. I had all the evidence in the world that someone had opened my window while I was out. But imagine you were with me, and you said, I don't believe your theory that someone opened the window. I don't know why, I just don't. Is that enough? Where is your evidence and what is your argument? I just don't believe your evidence. Is not an acceptable answer. To believe something, one must present counter evidence. So, what are our options if we don't want to believe in God in the face of evidences to the contrary? The first option is the lucky us hypothesis. It says, yes, admittedly, the chances were extremely low that our universe would ever come into existence, but lucky us, here we are. Just celebrate it. Proponents of this theory suggest ideas similar to a poker analogy. Imagine that you are dealt a poker hand that turns out to be a royal flush. Although it is highly unlikely and improbable statistically that you would be dealt that hand, you received it, so you celebrate. Lucky you. The problem with this analogy is that it does not compare apples to apples, because the statistics are not even close to comparable. For the analogy to work and the situation to be comparable, you would have to be dealt that perfect royal flush every hand forever. But if that were to happen, nobody would chalk it up to chance circumstances to be celebrated. It would take 3 hands before someone else at the table would accuse you of cheating, because everyone knows that chance isn't a rational explanation at all. And that's what we are all after, aren't we? The most rational explanation. The second option, extremely popular among skeptics, is what is called the multiverse theory. While it is highly improbable that our one universe would ever come into existence given the number of variables, the odds change if there are an infinite number of universes. Dawkins says that the anthropic principle can be answered by the suggestion that there are many universes coexisting like bubbles and foam in a multiverse. In other words, what if instead of not just one set of 122 dials, there are an infinite number of sets? The chances therefore increase that one of those sets would actually line up to give birth to our universe. Our time and space did indeed begin in our Big Bang, but this was just the latest in a long series of Big Bangs. If bang, expansion, contraction, crunch cycles have been going on forever like a cosmic accordion, we have a serial rather than a parallel version of the multiverse. Of all the universes in the series, only a minority has their dials turned to biogenetic conditions. And of course, the present universe has to be one of that minority because we are in it. This is a creative solution to the question of the origin of the universe, but unconvincing for three reasons. First, the multiverse and Big Crunch theories do not hold up under philosophical scrutiny. In one lecture, Darwin, Mind and Meaning, Alvin Plantinga points out the bankruptcy of the multiverse logic, saying that rejecting the anthropological principle based on the theory of a multiverse is tantamount to rejecting the evidence for the Earth's being round by pointing out that there are possible worlds in which we have all the evidence we do have for the Earth's being round, but in fact the Earth is flat. Whatever the worth of the argument from design, multiverse really fails to address it. Second, modern science is pretty certain that there will never be a big crunch because of what it is learning about the universe. Ironically, Dawkins recognizes this very point. As it turns out, the serial version of the multiverse must now be judged less likely than it once was, because recent evidence is starting to steer us away from the Big Crunch model. It now looks as though our own universe is destined to expand forever. Third, and most importantly, there is not one shred of evidence for either of these explanations, an infinite number of universes or a 20 billion year cycle. These belong to the realm of pure conjecture. These are faith positions with no evidence at all, and thus, ironically, in the end, atheism asks us to believe in an infinite number of metaphysical realities for which we have no evidence, while Christianity asks us to believe in one God for which we do actually have evidence. These are just a few of the reasons why more and more people, including myself, find it more rational to believe in the existence of God and not so.